Hi and welcome. In this brief lecture, we will look closer at the SDGs of the private sector. And I will discuss, among other things, how there has been an increased expectation for private sector to actively engage with sustainability initiatives, but also how the private sector has met the SDGs with an unprecedented enthusiasm, which we've not really seen with any other development agendas. So we'll take a closer look at the business case for the SDGs, but also some of the criticisms, both on a systemic and an operational level. And a lot of the concepts that I discussed today, you can also read more about in the articles that are listed in the reading section. The SDGs represented a major shift from the MDGs, with a wider agenda and some key differences that have helped it attract much more interest from the private sector than what we saw was the case with the Millennium Development Goals. First off, the MDGs had a developing country focus, and the emphasis was on meeting basic human development needs in these regions. The SDGs, however, take on a global universal approach, and this has helped create a much greater ownership globally, as the goals apply just as much to high-income countries as low and middle-income countries. Secondly, the MDGs focused on poverty reduction in various forms. And while this is also a key objective of the SDGs also take on a wider approach and aim to facilitate poverty reduction through a wider set of targets related to economic growth and decent work and industrialization and other issues that feel much more familiar to private sector actors than those who are traditionally considered to be typical developmental goals. Finally, the MDGs had a focus on donor financing. It was about high-income countries in the north helping the global south. The SDGs, however, are based on blended finance models and are aimed at leveraging private finance flows to facilitate the transformations that are required by the SDGs. So, a common narrative when it comes to financing of the SDGs is that we have to move from billions to trillions. And that is simply because the ambition and scale of the SDGs will require private finance flows. The United Nations Trade and Development Committee has estimated that the SDGs will cost around 5 to 7 trillion US dollars annually to achieve the goals. And out of this, up towards 4.5 trillion US dollars are needed in investments in low and middle income countries. And in this overview by the OECD, we can see that aid indicated in the gray area is not the main source of external finance to low and middle income countries, and that foreign direct investment is actually a significant part of the external finance that goes to these countries. So, since official development assistance only represents a fraction of the total overall financing need for the SDGs, the idea is to leverage on private finance flows and use a blended finance model. And in an article from 2018, Emma Maudsley writes that the logic is that the role of ODA and other forms of public finance should be to unlock, catalyze, and leverage much larger flows of private finance for development. And while there is little doubt that there is a huge gap between the ambitions of the SDGs and the available financing, many, including Maudsley, are skeptical of this development and what is often labeled a financialization of development. And some of the concern here is, for instance, linked to that of an increased complexity and perhaps even lack of accountability and transparency due to commercial privacy when private actors are involved. And some also worry about public finance being used to sort of escort private finance into new and developing markets. And another issue is that of risk and the volatility of finance markets, which could then impact the available finance for development. And while there is talk about risk in this connection, it is mostly about the risk to the investors and not the borrowers. But some of the mechanisms that are aimed at facilitating this blended finance model is, for instance, public-private partnerships, You also have financial incentive structures to incentivize investments in areas that might not be as commercially attractive. And finally, you have support mechanisms to abate risks, also to encourage investments in more volatile markets. Throughout the United Nations Sustainable Development Summits like Rio in 1992, Johannesburg 2002, and Rio Plus 20, there has been an increasing recognition of the role that private sector can play in advancing sustainable development. And while the private sector has always been an important contributor to economic growth and development through, for instance, leading investments, creating jobs, and developing new economic opportunities, they are increasingly being called upon to work alongside governments, donors, and NGOs to lead intentional development initiatives that are aimed at improving people's lives. And this also coincides with a notion from corporate social responsibility known as creating shared value. And Kramer, in an article from Shavens and colleagues, writes that he explains the logic behind this as being governments and NGOs cannot replace the private sector doing what it does best, innovating and delivering market-based solutions. And there are some strengths and characteristics of the private sector that make them a valuable partner and a necessary partner when it comes to advancing sustainable development. And part of this is resources. And here we mean everything from financial to also technical and human resources. The private sector is strong in innovation and technological development. They can also show great leadership, both through the vast network of their global supply chains, which encompass millions of people, but also through consumer influence. And finally, the private sector is often flexible and able to do quick turnarounds, which is necessary with the transformative agenda that the SDGs represent. In 2015, then Secretary General of the United Nations Ban Ki-moon said that he was counting on the private sector and that now was the time to mobilize the global business community as never before. And it is not only the UN who's expecting the private sector to step up, but businesses are also increasingly seeing the advantages of engaging with social and environmental challenges that are also represented in the SDGs. And one reason is increased global exposure. And many companies are now much more engaged with poor and fragile countries across the globe, both directly but also indirectly through supply chains. Secondly, there's an increasing attention from the public, NGOs, and activists on sustainability issues related to corporate responsibility. And especially in terms of climate change and activism, we have seen a lot happening over the past few years, and no company can really ignore that issue if they want to be taken seriously. There is also the issue of social and traditional media exposure. And we know now that stories of any corporate malpractice, such as corruption or poor treatment of workers or environmental pollution, will spread around the globe in no time. And we're also increasingly seeing social media activism, which is aimed at holding companies to account for their corporate malpractices. You also have an increase in more stringent laws and regulations related to corporate sustainability. This, of course, in addition to more non-binding agreements such as the SDGs. But finally, you also have more aware consumers. And in line with the growing awareness in the general public, we're seeing an increase in ethical consumption, and that consumers do not really want to make choices that do not contribute to, or they do want to make choices that do not contribute to harming the environment, or they don't want to buy products that have been produced under poor working conditions. So customers are in general more aware and demanding that companies provide them with responsible choices.